How does a good Christian respond to resistance? How did Jesus respond when people resisted him? I answered that question in last Sunday's platform presentation. I'm Pastor Mike, and I preach and teach at Sonrise Fellowship. As a church, we looked at Jesus' encounter with two demon-possessed men and a village that didn't want change. I hope this message is helpful. And if it is, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others on social media if you think it might be a benefit to them. So I hope you enjoy this presentation of the Two Exorcisms, how Jesus used authority when faced with resistance. We're continuing our series today called The Unexpected Ramifications of the King's Authority. If you remember, we've looked at his authority over illness and over storms. Today's message I'm calling Two Exorcisms, and the subtitle of that is, How did Jesus use his authority against resistance? Now, to get this kicked off, I want to tell you a couple of stories about me. The first takes place in a garage that looks a lot like this slide right here. That's not the same one that it took place in. It's just a very similar picture. We used this garage as a break room. We had a picnic table set up in the middle of it, and in the corner of this garage/break room was our time clock. And so I was on my way this one evening after a very long day to the time clock to punch out. And as I walked into this garage/break room, I immediately knew that I was in danger, because across the room, looking right at me as I walked in, was another employee of this company who had a reputation for being intellectual, and he liked to give speeches. And he was instructing this little group of people he had collected, about 8 or 10 people, on how Jesus Christ was the cause of all the ills in the Western world. It was a typical topic for him. Well, I tried to sneak across the room to the time clock, and I got all clocked out, and I was almost back to the door. Thought I was going to get away when he, at the top of his lungs, "What do you think, Sommerfeld?" And I turned around and I looked at him, and he was grinning from ear to ear. And I looked at the rest of the people in the room with this confused look in their face, and I knew if I walked out of there without giving some kind of an answer, they were all going to go home believing he was right. And so I began to give my answer. And when I was done, nobody in the room doubted which side was right and which side was wrong. And I went home a little bit more satisfied than I thought I would be. The second story, however, didn't go quite that well. It took place earlier than that. It was when I had been a believer in Jesus Christ for just a little while and been studying the Word, when I interacted with an elderly gentleman, considerably older than me, who had not been a believer for very long. And during the conversation, he got around to saying that no human being had ever seen the face of God. Well, I had just read Exodus 33. I had just read Numbers 12, where God had pointed out to the people that he spoke with Moses face to face. So I set about correcting this man's error. Unfortunately, I didn't do it with the humility that I probably should have. I embarrassed this man much more than he deserved. In fact, he deserved my honor, not my embarrassment. It's been something that I've not been very proud of most of my life. And these two stories highlight the two possibilities for responding to people who are resisting our authority or confronting and challenging our authority. The first possibility is to be too bold, like I was with the elderly gentleman. And this happens in several ways as we interact with each other. It might be taking too many risks, that kind of boldness where we don't take into account the damage we could be doing with our bold responses. It could be an unfiltered mouth. It could be someone who just doesn't think about the things they're saying, and pretty soon they're saying things that they shouldn't be saying. Or those who are more committed to winning the argument than winning the person. So being too bold is one of the options for when we're being resisted, or our authorities being challenged, or our viewpoints being challenged. The other one is to not be bold enough. And that can happen when someone is overly cautious, or someone is fearful, or someone may just be shy and not want to confront someone. And it raises the question for us, and the question we're going to talk about today is, what does the Bible say? How did Jesus deal with it? So the biblical context we're talking here stems from the word pros. It's a Greek word that goes back a long ways, and it's usually defined as strength under control. In fact, originally the word was used to describe a war horse, but not just any war horse. A war horse that had been trained and conditioned to the point that it was totally under the control of its master. In English, we have a similar word, or at least a word with a similar definition. The word is meekness. Many people think of meekness as weakness, but meekness is not weakness. It's strength under control. And in the Greek culture, that word pros came to mean eventually wisdom to respond with a purpose. Now, Jesus uses this concept when he finally gets across the Sea of Galilee. You remember the last couple of weeks we've talked about how Jesus was crossing the Sea of Galilee, and he was resisted initially from leaving Capernaum, and then there was a big storm in the middle of the sea. When we get to Matthew 8, verse 28, Jesus gets out of the boat and is immediately confronted by two men who are possessed by demons. And as they meet, Matthew tells us that they are coming out of the tombs. Apparently, these men were so violent and so antisocial that the only place for them to get shelter when there was a storm was in the tombs. They couldn't go into the cities anymore. And as they came out, they immediately began to confront Jesus and ask him what business he has being there. And they ask him if he's come to torture them ahead of time. And in all this, Matthew doesn't present Jesus as saying a word. And then the men see the pigs that are on the side of the hill. A big herd of pigs that are grazing there, foraging there, and they look at Jesus and say, if you're going to cast us out, cast us into the pigs. Now, personally, I think that was a ploy. I think that they intended, after Jesus left, to leave the pigs and go straight back into the two men. Why would they want to stay in pigs when they could torment human beings? So Jesus says, go, and they go. They leave the two men, they go into the pigs. Immediately, the entire herd of pigs runs down the steep hill and into the sea and is drowned. Now, there's two possibilities here. Most people think that the demons drove those pigs into the water to drown them just to be cruel, but that doesn't make any sense to me. Otherwise, why would they have asked Jesus not to send them out of the bodies, not to cast them out somewhere where they could be tormented? They had some other motive for going into the pigs, so why would the demons drive the pigs into the water? The only other option that I can come up with is that the pigs actually just did this. The pigs realized this is a horrible way to live. We're not going to tolerate this, and themselves decide to take their own lives so that they don't have to live under the influence of these demons. The herdsmen saw all of this happening. And so they leave and go into the city and tell, notice what Matthew says, they tell about the two demon-possessed men. He doesn't say anything about the pigs. And the people hear about these two demon-possessed men, and they go out to where Jesus is, and they see these two men standing there talking to Jesus. That part comes from the other cross-references into the other Gospels. They see the men in their right mind, clothed and speaking to Jesus. And then the city, the whole city, all the population, ask Jesus to leave. They beg him to leave. Many of the commentators seem to believe that they're worried about the financial ramifications of Jesus staying in the area. They've lost their herd of pigs. Well, they've lost that either way. Some mention that it might have been a fear that Jesus, as a Jew, might use his power and authority to punish them because they were pagans raising pigs for food. But I got a feeling, the way Matthew has worded this, that Matthew wants us to think that they're afraid of his authority over the demons. And if he can exercise that kind of authority to change these two men's life, and he uses that authority again, what are the ramifications for them? And they're just absolutely terrified by it. So they beg him to leave. And Jesus does something very surprising. We have to go into the next chapter where we see in verse 1 that Jesus, getting back into the boat, crossed over the lake and went back to his hometown. He went right back to where he started. He went right back to Capernaum. And that's where we get into some of this concept of how Jesus reacted to their resistance. And we can see as we take this whole story and not allow the chapter breaks to keep us from understanding it, that Jesus' exercise of his authority is tempered by the situation that he is in. When he's confronted by the demons, and they challenge his authority to judge them and to determine their future, he gives the command, and they're destroyed. But when he's confronted by the people who are frightened and concerned, he simply returns the other way. As we follow Jesus' example, our reaction can be like his reaction. Our reaction to resistance can depend on the resistant, the person resisting us. If that person is ignorant, then we probably should be softer. If they're not acting out of malice and they're not damaging someone else's spiritual growth or their safety, then we can react to them softer in the way Paul did in 1 Corinthians chapters 8, 9, and 10, when he's asked whether they can eat meat purchased in the local market, which has been sacrificed in the pagan temples. And in verse 11 of chapter 8, Paul says, "And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed? The brother for whom Christ died? The other person is weak. They don't understand your freedom to eat that kind of meat. And so you need to restrain yourself and react softly to that person rather than demanding your rights." But if we're being resisted by someone who is arrogant, then we are called upon to be more stern, just as Paul was in 2 Corinthians 11, 12, and 13, where there are people coming into Corinth and telling the Corinthian church that Paul is not qualified to be their leader, that they should not be doing as Paul teaches, but as they teach. And they're trying to lead a rebellion against Paul. And in chapter 13, verse 2 of 2 Corinthians, Paul puts it on the line. He says, "I warned those who sinned before, and all the others, and I warn them now, while absent, as I did when I was present on my second visit, that if I come again, I will not spare them." There is no way to paraphrase that statement in a way that is acceptable in a church, in a worship service. Because he's saying things, he's threatening things spiritually that are not going to be pleasant. And when he gets there, he means to put an end to their rebellion. And if we follow Jesus' example to be soft with the ignorant but stern with the arrogant, then we will live a victorious Christian life. We will have the privilege of overcoming our own temptation to be harsh or our own temptation to be shy and be reacting to our fear. And we'll have victory over our own reactions in those situations. But we also will not be cowed by the arrogant. When somebody shows up to bully us, we won't just back down and let them have their way. And as believers following Jesus' example, we also won't be bullies ourselves against those who are innocent. By putting their need first, we will be guarding ourselves against becoming someone who's being too harsh. And as we follow Jesus' example in this way, the unexpected ramification of his authority is that we too will fit the definition of meek. That our strength will be totally under the King's authority. We're continuing our series today called The Unexpected. Well, that was our presentation from last Sunday. If you live near Enid, Oklahoma, and you enjoyed this presentation, I hope you'll consider visiting us next week to see more. Our location is listed on our Facebook page. And also, consider sharing this content with people who you think might benefit from it. When you share this information, this content, you help get the Scripture Making Difference out to the rest of the world. And hope you'll come back next week and receive more of our platform presentation and some of our Scripture that makes a difference. Until then, God bless, and continue to let Scripture make a difference